Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm your dean. I love saying that. Yeah, it's over. So as we launch this afternoon's Welcome Back event, let me introduce you to a couple people here who have helped make this possible. So on the events team, our Associate Director of Public Programs, Sarah Rafson. I'm not sure where you are. I want to thank Sarah, Raquel Rivera, who's our Public Programs Coordinator, and Matt Smith, who controls the world from the AV booth above. I also want to thank my team, Amanda, Bia, and Joy from my office, because they actually are the ones who organize this event. Thank you. So let me begin by situating us historically and geographically. So our school sits on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts people, who continue to hold it sacred, and from whom we today realize we can learn much about how best to live with the land rather than only from the land. I also want to note that there is live captioning. You can point your device at that QR code and get live captioning here, or if you're Zooming in or on the webinar, you can do it from the closed caption at the bottom. So, welcome to fall 2024. So we already welcomed 405 new students to the school over orientation, which brings our total to 978. There are a lot of students this year. We're already fully immersed within a fantastic slate of courses, 139 total across the school. And we already had an inspiring event here in Piper last Tuesday with the presentations by and conversations among several of the practitioners included in Professor in Practice Farshid Mousavi's extraordinary exhibition out in the Drucker Gallery. I also recommend that you all stop by to see Associate Professor in Practice Belindo Tato's installation Polynature, which is up in the Kirkland backyard. It's a vertical garden of 1,400 local plants. I am lucky if I can keep one alive. And this is an amazing structure. It's only going to be up, so it's a vertical garden of these plants. It's only up for a couple weeks, so stop by and see it. So as I noted in the email that I sent out to the community on Friday afternoon, realizing afterwards that Friday afternoon is not the best day for sending out emails, so it was at 1:36 in case you want to look it up in your inbox. John Andrews' building, Gund Hall, our school's heart, was designed to embody the school's collaborative ethos, unifying 3 departments into one single school under one symbolic roof. Our school's students, faculty, and staff come from every corner of the world and with all sorts of varying experiences and expertise. It's our vast multiplicity of perspectives that fuels our classes, our conversations, our research, and our projects. In my email to you all, I turned to Anthony Appiah's book, Cosmopolitanism, which I was surprised to realize is almost 2 decades old at this point, but it seems ever timelier every time I read it, given the complexity of our current world. In it, Appiah urges his readers to learn about people in other places, take an interest in their civilizations, their arguments, their errors, their achievements, not because this will bring us to agreement, but because it will help us get used to one another. And I think that's a really great way of understanding how we all operate in this big, messy school. A spirit of cosmopolitanism, in short, is fueled by a genuine and generous interest in and conversation with others. So today's event is a chance to learn about the work of others, our 8 new ladder faculty, as a means of catalyzing conversation with them and with others, afterwards at the reception that follows and for the rest of the year. I've asked Rachel, Magda, Maurice, Iman, Elisa, Angela, Kaja, and Karen Lee to very briefly present how they see their work as being relevant to the school and/or to the moment. Now, I want to be clear, they are not presenting full-on lectures. They each have a mere 12 minutes to present essentially one point that is intended to seed conversation with you all. As an aside, let me note that tomorrow night we do have a full-on lecture from another member of our faculty, Eric Howler, who will give a lecture entitled Clay, Pedagogy and Practice. So if tomorrow's lecture can be seen as a complete dinner entree, let me underscore that this afternoon features 8 amuse-bouches, brief talks by these faculty who represent all 3 of the GSD's departments. I'll introduce all 8 at once so that we can move seamlessly from one to the next. My introductions will be absurdly brief so as to avoid eating up the precious time we have. If you would like a more extensive introduction, just turn to the Crimson, which ran a feature on them last week, or look them up on our website. We'll begin with Rachel Weber, who will be joining us in January as Professor of Urban Planning, coming to us from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Rachel is an urban planner, a political economist, and an economic geographer who researches the relationships between finance and the built environment. Second, also from UPD, will be Magda Maaoui, an assistant professor of urban planning, whose research explores the housing production cycle from snout to tail, starting with housing being the consequence of regulation and policy, as well as of design and construction, and finishing with understanding its health and environmental impacts. Third will be Maurice Cox, Emma Bloomberg Professor in Residence of Urban Planning and Design. Like Rachel, Maurice comes to us from Chicago. I also come from Chicago, but this isn't a cabal, where he was the Commissioner of Planning and Development since 2019. The best title for Maurice, who's been a professor at Tulane and UVA, among other schools, is citizen architect. He has held many roles in public service, and his practice has always been aimed at improving the urban realm for all citizens. Iman Fayyad, Assistant Professor of Architecture, will be fourth. Iman rejoins us coming from Syracuse University, where we let her be for a couple years after she left us as a design critic. Founding director of the research and design practice Project IF, Project : IF. I don't know if you say the colon when you describe your title, probably not. Iman focuses on relations between architectural geometry and the material economy, sensory perception, and the politics of public space. Elisa Iturbe, also assistant professor of architecture, will be fifth. Elisa earned dual master's degrees from the Yale School of Environment and the Yale School of Architecture, and she continues to focus her research and practice on the intersection of these two fields, exposing the allegiance between architecture and carbon modernity. Angela Pang, assistant professor in practice of architecture, is number 6 this afternoon. Many of you know Angela, who's been here as a design critic. She also spoke at the event last Tuesday. She most recently completed an archive and research center and a dormitory, both for the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Moving to landscape architecture, Kaja Tally-Schumacher joins us as assistant professor of landscape history. She will teach environmental history as well as seminars focused on the design landscapes and environments of the ancient Roman world. She co-directs an archaeological dig at Pompeii, which just received a prominent NEH Digital Humanities grant. And last, but certainly not least, Lee Bar-Sinai joins us as assistant professor of materials and design of landscape architecture. She comes to us from the School of Engineering and Design at the Technical University of Munich. Her research explores evolving relationships between matter and technology at the intersection of landscape architecture, robotic construction, and the environment. I'm thrilled to welcome these 8 new Ladder faculty members who, along with our 67 other Ladder faculty and this semester's 75, I have so many numbers in this intro, visiting lecturers and design critics, each bring a remarkable depth of intellectual expertise and profound enthusiasm for collaboration within and across all 9 of our programs, the entire university, and the world beyond. Please join me in welcoming this extraordinary cohort of new faculty to the GSD, and we'll start with Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Whiting, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's a real thrill to be here with you and to be joining this amazing cohort. So again, my name is Rachel Weber, and I'll be starting as a professor in the Urban Planning and Design Department in January. And I was happy that Dean Whiting suggested that we frame our comments this afternoon around the topic of relevance, because I've wrestled long and hard with the question of what is the role of the academic in society, what should it be, and I've come to believe that scholarship really needs to do double duty. It should, of course, produce new knowledge, but it should also aspire to have an impact on other scholarly disciplines, on practice, and on policy formation. Now, it's not always easy or comfortable for scholars and their work to move between the academy and other worlds. It entails privileges and power relations that need to be carefully considered. To help me negotiate the boundaries between scholarship and its outside, I draw inspiration from what geographer Cindy Katz calls in-betweenness. Katz encourages us to position ourselves between description and analysis, between here and there, between the present, past, and future, between subject positions, between discourses, between us and them, between the exotic and mundane, between the unique and the general. Occupying liminal, in-between spaces has allowed me to participate in conversations on timely, important topics. It has also allowed me to ask hard questions, not just of academics, but of practitioners and policymakers. I'll give some examples from my work to illustrate this concept. So I'm coming to the GSD from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I've spent the last 27 years teaching, researching, and providing policy advice. I studied the relationship, as Sarah mentioned, between financial markets and the built environment. The structural integrity of an office tower or a toll road may look intact and unchanging on the surface, but the ownership stakes in these projects are often carved up and shifted about in different geographically dispersed markets. Claims to the income generated by urban infrastructures move between the balance sheets of asset managers, pension funds, even university endowments. In my work, I trace the circulation of capital, analyzing complex, tiered networks of extraction anchored by portfolios of properties and property-based debt. I use forensic accounting skills to follow the financial life cycles of a diverse set of public and privately owned assets in different cities, from Related's Hudson Yards project on the west side of Manhattan to the Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico. However, it's really Chicago's model of infrastructure privatization with which I am most familiar. In the first decade of the 2000s, the city of Chicago sold off the revenues from its parking meters, garages, and a 7.8-mile-long elevated toll road called the Chicago Skyway to the highest bidders. On the surface, it looked like the city was getting a good deal. It received payouts twice what their analysts estimated. However, the research my colleagues and I conducted found that the city's estimates of value failed to account for the financial engineering techniques that allowed its new private owners to wring more rents from these assets. In other words, they undervalued them. Moreover, these deals created new risks and exposures. For example, they obligated the city to reorient a broad range of public activities, from zoning to traffic mitigation, toward the protection of repayment streams and asset values. I also use my training in science and technology studies to analyze the socio-technical devices that facilitate capital circulation through the built environment. These include artifacts like plans, renderings, and pitch books that discursively position places and other income-generating opportunities in relationship to each other, calculative practices like appraisal and revenue forecasting techniques that assign value to property, and ownership vehicles and financial instruments like real estate investment trusts that capture and redistribute capital gains extracted from real estate. These market prosthetics are part of invisible architectures that make buildings and infrastructures fungible as financial assets and legible to global investors. To observe the operations of these devices in their natural habitats, I conduct ethnographic research. For example, I interviewed 80 planners and real estate practitioners for my 2016 book, From Boom to Bubble. The book highlights the role of actors like investment brokers, instruments like commercial mortgage-backed securities, and legal rhetorical concepts like obsolescence in drawing capital to commercial real estate in Chicago's Loop during the first decade of the 21st century. Although not technically a sequel, my current book project, called The Urban Oracular, Speculating on the Future City, investigates a pervasive affect that I encountered when interviewing real estate investors and planners, a confidence bordering on hubris about knowing the future. This is an image of a multifamily building proposed on the north side of Chicago. The money partner, aptly named Free Market Ventures, doesn't limit themselves to what works now, but challenges themselves to discover what works next, acting as if they have a cognitive wormhole to the future. For this book, I went back to some of the same asset managers and investment banks that I interviewed for From Boom to Bubble. But this time I was there to talk to the quants. These are analysts that model property markets using proprietary data, algorithms, and probabilistic calculations to help their firms make investment and trading decisions. They are tasked with conceiving of the future in the face of radical instability to some extent caused by their own firm's speculations. I asked interview subjects to walk me through their forecasting models and to discuss how their model outputs moved through internal hierarchies within their firms and through their own external professional networks. In the book, I show how these predictive knowledge practices enable real estate investors to convert the future into capital. The accuracy of their forecasts is in many ways a moot point. Control over what I call the means of prediction allows investors to bend future values around their own positions. My ability to access interview subjects and artifacts for my research, both quantitative and qualitative, brings me back to the relationship between relevance and in-betweenness that I started with. When conducting interviews, I need to demonstrate my familiarity with the technical aspects of practice. Yet as an academic, I have to have critical distance. I seek broader explanations for phenomena that go beyond functional or self-serving justifications. If you can operate across multiple registers simultaneously, you increase your chances of relevance. I'm preaching to the converted here because so many at the GSD already enjoy this kind of crossover status. You work as both practitioners and scholars. You speak at least 2 dialects. You read scholarly articles and books as well as trade publications. Being in between often involves more than double the work because you're engaged constantly in a process of translation, but you're also better positioned to speak to a wider audience. In order to be relevant outside the academy, it also helps to have something tangible to offer to non-academics. Sometimes it's because you develop expertise in some obscure, specialized aspect of a particular policy or some segment of the tax code. So I was one of the first to study how tax increment financing, a popular municipal financing and economic development strategy, affected school district revenues. I wrote op-eds on the topic and was a resource for journalists and policymakers. Other times, I've been less intentional and been happily surprised when the theories I've helped develop in books and articles about financialization, about privatization, about austerity, have helped activists frame the way they challenge the status quo, as they did in the movement to stop school closures in Chicago in 2013. Relevance is a little easier when you're asked to sit at the table. Building a reputation not just for critique, but for offering constructive advice has resulted in invitations to join select policy circles. I've been asked to give testimony in state legislatures, write affidavits for lawsuits, and serve as an advisor for elected officials and political candidates on topics as varied as economic development incentives, infrastructure finance, and property taxes. Sometimes it gets a little awkward, I will admit, and I'm happy to share some stories over a drink at the reception, but participating in real-time issues has allowed me, in some small way, to have influence over policies and plans. The last means of achieving relevance that I'll mention today is perhaps the most gratifying but also accessible to us here at the GSD, and that is teaching the next generation of reflexive practitioner. Graduate students come back to school thirsty for skills, and it's my responsibility to provide them. I teach the craft of urban planning, but I also teach planning as an intellectual field. My pedagogy revolves around translating abstract concepts into analytical techniques that can enhance students' capacities to make professional judgments. Being comfortable in the in-between enhances students' abilities to find jobs when they graduate. And then, if I'm lucky, they become informants for my research, clients for my studio classes, and very importantly, colleagues, closing the circle and helping to knit together this imagined divide between theory and practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome to your new year at the GSD. It's really something that I'm grateful for, to briefly present my work alongside such great new colleagues. My work is comparative at the nexus of housing, public and environmental health, spanning North America, Europe, and North Africa. Today, I'll be focusing on Paris to link my output as a city planner to my analytical work that makes the success and failure of French healthy housing initiatives relevant to a global audience. You might think housing, health, Paris, surely the Olympics were a peak on my calendar. Not at all. I tried to escape them. I did what we Parisians like to do, be cynical. I complained about a city that would be barricaded, deserted, too expensive, from the subway to the Airbnbs, slowed down by what promised to look like a logistical fiasco. But then I quickly had to make room for some of that Olympics magic, myth or not. I regained a sense of city pride, and as a planner, I realized that my work was connected, whether I liked it or not, to this mega event, through my practice, through my research, and through my teaching. I could own these Olympics in my own way, make them relevant. All of it was so connected to city planning. And reporters wrote that wonderfully, and I'm quoting, the Seine opening ceremony, the temporary stadiums built on iconic squares, the cycling races through the streets, even worries over whether the Seine was going to be swimmable or not for the swimming competition. The myth was there. Paris, the center of the world, edifying in its beauty. Mayor Hidalgo also daringly showcased the urban politics she's led with her left and Green Council coalition since 2014. In the belly of the City of Lights, with the suburb of Saint-Saint-Denis as the beating heart of the Games, a political program focused on creating a city for people, not cars, a program promoting ecology and affordable housing. I watched, and I knew it may take years for us to know the Games' actual winners and losers, beyond the medalists. But surely the Games won me over. Me not just dreading the Games, but doubting that Paris could even pull it off, feeling uncomfortable, just owning how much my practice and my research had to do with this successful no-build model, which not only worked, but was also beautiful. Accepting that critical does not necessarily mean I had to criticize. This tension I felt, that's something philosopher Roland Barthes wrote about in Mythologies. Perhaps the most accessible, the most pop culture element or text of French theory by far. It deconstructs all our preconceived notions and, frankly, malaise when we try to conceptualize things like the Tour de France, cars, milks, French fries, and even boxing. He could have easily written about the Olympics as an object of study and how to make room for the mythology in one's work. Making room for the mythology and extracting what's relevant, I had done that all along without really knowing it. For instance, for years, in addition to practicing as a planner, I researched how housing coalitions advanced healthy planning strategies and goals in the metro region. One of my case studies was located in the inner ring suburb of Paris, right north of its 18th arrondissement district in Seine-Saint-Denis, home to the Olympics, which had catalyzed a massive investment, new subway stations, and several Olympics-related infrastructure projects. It was, since 2014, the site of a battle over housing quality. And to the question, do poor neighborhoods have leverage over government prerogatives and developer desires that goes beyond a simple not in my backyard, this case really answered with a resounding yes. Zooming in, we're looking at the suburb of Aubervilliers, located in the direct vicinity of the Olympics. It's really close to the Aquatic Center, which perhaps you've heard about, and the future Grand Paris Express Line 15. As a reminder, Grand Paris Express is the largest urban mass transit project in the Western world, with 200 kilometers of track connecting 68 new stations. This transit expansion was planned in concert with the sites for the 2024 Olympics, which are set as a context in the northeastern part of the metro region. In 2023, actually, the GSD awarded the green prize to the Grand Paris Express. Together, the two initiatives, Olympics and GPE, have turned suburbs like Aubervilliers into sites of unprecedented real estate development and speculation. 40% of Aubervilliers' residents are foreign-born, and fully half live under the poverty line, making it the second poorest city in the capital region. Historically, it's always been a polluted suburb, the dumping ground, where Paris dumped its industrial waste, and with the rise of cars, it became known as the city's go-to open-air garage. The myth turns into relevant research when you inscribe it into a certain geography of Parisian health. It was one of the hardest hit communities of France during the COVID-19 pandemic, and if you look at the map on the left, in less than a 15-minute journey, the risk of dying in a given year still increases by 82% between the wealthiest districts of Paris in the south and the suburbs around the new Olympics infrastructure. But because it is just over the highway from Paris, it's also beginning to gentrify and attract interest from market rate developers. In 2014, in line with the extension of the Grand Paris Express, developers proposed plans to transform the city's obsolete military site that you see on the right into a gigantic eco-district. It was proposed as a 36-acre project that would equip the neighborhood with 1,800 new units, 25% set aside for lowest income households, and a new state-of-the-art Olympics aquatic center. You might ask, how did this affordable, healthy housing project come to be on a parcel so valuable for market rate development in a gentrifying inner ring suburb like Aubervilliers? That might be a David and Goliath planning story. Aubervilliers is what we refer to as a red suburb, a historically communist stronghold. So it's not a surprise that the local communist housing coalition, defeated now but in place at the time, led by then Mayor Myriam Darkaoui, a real maire bâtisseur or builder mayor, followed 3 steps to negotiate this deal. She first filed a complaint, as one does, then she froze building permits, then she topped it all with a formalized public-private partnership. Beyond the Olympics myth, progressive new public management with a French twist. This gave way to a fast-tracked upzoning procedure for the entire Fort parcel, which allowed developers to build at maximum capacity. Second, the coalition had a say in every aspect of the eco-district healthy housing design, including that the site's beloved 90-year-old community garden, which had occupied 5% of the land, be preserved, if in some cases relocated. The direct impact this coalition had on a series of zoning codes, charts, and plans associated with the Olympics perimeter illustrates the micropolitics of planning and a one-of-a-kind rethinking of design politics. Looking at this case shows that it's possible to have both hard-won, significant community benefits, such as a pool access, community gardens, state-of-the-art sustainable architecture, and a very, very proactive and aggressive pro-housing approach. This story is not particular to the suburb of Aubervilliers. It shows that in Paris and elsewhere too, there's no irreconcilable conflict between community involvement, developer concessions, upzoning, growth, and healthy planning goals. It's what characterizes the Paris housing model, more so than the frail 15-minute city concept, a mythology I certainly don't believe in, but we won't get into that today. This lesson was top of mind when I worked at the Paris planning agency, APUR, where I was in charge of identifying and disseminating healthy planning initiatives. Compared to the other built-up older American cities like New York or Boston, Paris was building more housing faster. But healthy approaches were always thought of and still thought of as on the margins of the planning field. And not at the center. And that's something that Mayor Hidalgo, Anne Hidalgo, that you see here on the slide, was ready to change. She made our work around health central to her political agenda and her planning agenda. And to make us attuned to the important work that still needed to be done, particularly in the field of environmental health, she moved our agency from a building that looked like this to an old warehouse overlooking the highway and the city's waste collection center. All it took to move us away from myths into relevance. Some projects we worked on were very small in size, from the school street to the hospital courtyard, or the scale of one housing units. Others were large-scale health impact assessments, community programs, and health disparity studies. My team evaluated, for instance, the Grand Paris Express developers' proposed environmental impact charter, which orients new housing across all 68 stations of the new Metro line, for large perimeters, infill housing, or smaller parcels. Such design elements as ceiling height, cross-ventilation, and so on for 8,000 future units, evaluated through the lens of thermal comfort to mitigate urban heat islands. While my work was never simply celebrating the impacts of large development projects, I also wanted to question the pure criticism around the Olympics, or the Grand Paris Express for that matter. For instance, I co-authored a Lincoln Institute grant project showing that housing supply was steadily increasing in the redeveloped perimeters, but that compared to similar hot markets like New York, there was no ground for hyper-gentrification-induced displacement claims or an actual spike in rents and sales prices. I continued carrying this type of work at the Joint Center for Housing Studies and will also do so through a French-American Albertine Foundation grant. We adopted dozens of findings about small to mid-sized health initiatives into the new zoning regulations of the city's pioneering PLU bioclimatique, a strategic land use plan that will orient what gets built or rehabbed for the next 20 years, pioneering a way of planning the city with health and climate change at the forefront. I hope to continue exploring this, for instance, at the GSD's Healthy Places Design Lab, led by Anne Forsyth and Jennifer Molinsky. In addition to developing data analysis that made it into zoning codes, a priority is to publish research for larger audiences. In 2022, I collaborated to the French issue of Architectural Review, where I critically discussed healthy planning work led by Mayor Hidalgo's administration, as well as other planners and architects working in the city. This piece was among the magazine's most read stories of that year. I also wrote about this in 2 upcoming collective books. It's in French, who cares, you might say. One of them, Nos lieux communs, out this Wednesday, will be translated to English in a few months. And my take in the second one, out next month, will be distilled in upcoming peer-reviewed publications in English. My first experience at Harvard goes back to 2018, when I co-taught a summer school on healthy urbanism with the extraordinaire late Rob Blue, whose mentorship lives on. Last year, I got to work with fantastic students when I co-taught Core Studio with terrific colleagues here, which I coordinate this year as well. I'll also talk about all this in a fall project-based course, Do No Harm, Dilemmas in Planning for Health, with the Paris-based client Roofscapes. First class is tomorrow at 9 a.m. in GUN 318. And in the spring, I'll teach at home and abroad, housing in comparative perspective in partnership with the New York-based Urban Design Forum. Thanks for listening, and I'm leaving with music on, which is perfect.
Can we just keep the music on, please? Hey, GSD, it's wonderful to be here, to be back after some 20 years from my Loeb Fellowship and teaching my first option studio on Detroit, where I later went on to live and work. So a little bit about my journey here and the roots of my design advocacy. I grew up in Brooklyn. My parents, immigrants from the Bahamas, would raise 9 children here. I was the youngest. During the 20-plus years that we owned our home, I watched a socially and economically vibrant community fall into disrepair and disinvestment. I remember very distinctly when the bulldozers arrived. My house was at the fault line of urban renewal. Fortunately, our little block remained intact, and but for the fact that families owned their homes, my block would have been completely demolished. I would later come to understand that the decline of my neighborhood was mirrored in hundreds and hundreds of communities just like mine, and this was the result of intentional race-based public policies like urban renewal, the federal highway construction, redlining, and many, many others that segregated communities and starved them of the resources they needed to thrive. So when I arrived in Detroit in 2015, I found an incredibly resilient community of hundreds of thousands of individuals who simply refused to leave and give up on their city. My job as the planning director was to understand why they stayed, to see them as citizens worthy of being surrounded by beauty. In fact, I have come to believe that it's ultimately about people and that everyone has a right to live in a socially, environmentally, and economically beautifully designed community. I discovered that the soul of a city, any city, resides in its neighborhoods. You can't transform a city for all if you lose its soul. I've worked to transform the places where people actually live out their daily lives. I discovered that it's about streets. Streets is places of congregation, places you are invited to stay and engage as a pedestrian on foot. It's about streets that communicate a sense of belonging and welcomes all ages and incomes, streets that spur the kind of mixed-use environment that says to entrepreneurs, open your locally owned business here because incredible foot traffic and community thrives here. The notion of a neighborhood serving Main Street that's meant to be walked to from within 20 minutes of your home, streets for pedestrians first, and other modes such as bikes and cars integrated secondly. This is where a central canon of my approach to planning and design can be discerned. The development of a typology of streets, you engage stakeholders, refine strategies, do a pilot, then craft a policy, then take it to scale. It's about plazas, places that are multi-purpose and communicate a sense that this is a joyous place, a place where you belong. This series of public open plazas, pop courts, is a Chicago Planning Department initiative that I created as part of the city's pandemic recovery efforts that repurposed vacant lots along disinvested and troubled commercial corridors on the south and west side of Chicago, turning what was believed to be a liability, vacant lots, into a community asset. Where restorative urban planning policy comes in was to take this one neighborhood experiment and turn it into a scalable grant program that has produced 10 different tactical urban plazas across 10 different neighborhoods, and to do so with economy and innovation. It's also about parks that speak to our need to be in nature, to recreate, to see ourselves as a larger democratic collective. This image of a riverfront Central Park that anticipates the urban development around a great outdoor room was so compelling that developers who had staked out this same land for private development were pushed to the sides where the density and value was significantly increased as a result of creating a public realm. It's also about parks nestled in existing neighborhood fabrics that have the power to instantly solidify a sense of place and generate reinvestment along its edges. It's about greenways that repurpose abandoned infrastructure of cities and other forms of mobility that act as the connective tissue between neighborhoods. This 2-mile pilot gave the city of Detroit the confidence to take on one of the most ambitious greenway systems, 27 miles long, a linear park connecting 25 different neighborhoods and crossing 3 cities, connecting them all to the Detroit River and to each other. This $250 million park system that is for pedestrians and bicycle mobility is being built in phases, first in neighborhoods that have historically had the lowest rate of car ownership and have had the lowest level of public investment in amenities of this type. It's about telling history through buildings that have witnessed it and survived to remind us of collective memories, finding ways to add new layers of history and contemporary stories to be told through addition. With so many vacant buildings available in Detroit, how to catalog them, mothball them until the right use is found, and even reinventing new planning tools such as tactical preservation that sizes the program and financing available to rehab only the portion of the asset that is available, and the remainder to be mothballed. Returning a long since shuttered religious complex to a new public center of community, this time for the arts, like the Shepherd, using it to spur residential infill in the surrounding areas. And it's about development that has character and how to inspire a new generation of community developers to place design at the center of their goals for redevelopment. This is about filling the gaps left from decades of disinvestment in low-income neighborhoods. It's about increasing the mix of uses and densities and incomes and honoring these iconic neighborhood buildings that are beloved by residents, aspiring to excellence in contemporary architecture, able to stand side by side in a historic context. Then carefully inserting the missing middle density, explored through home ownership in ways that rebuild and reknit neighborhoods incrementally together over time. Creating new building typologies that allow for greater density within a traditional single-family neighborhood while providing new contemporary ways of living. This was the goal of Brush Park, City Modern, that brought together 5 different architects, multiple developers to design and build 400 units at multiple scales, at multiple incomes and types to produce a truly mixed income neighborhood that could be built over time. So I believe that access to quality design, to a quality design environment is a right. And it is our call to action to use every discipline that we teach, that we learn, that we share, to be used at the service of designing for all. Thank you.
Good evening, or afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to be back here. I'm Iman Fayyad, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture. As a designer and educator, I'm interested in interrogating the very processes that define the discipline of architecture, primarily the translation of ideas from drawing to material to building. Broadly, I'm interested in techniques of geometric projection as opportunities that allow us to stretch our imaginations and push the envelopes of what our disciplinary tools can provide. Specifically, I look at the relationship between flatness and three-dimensional form. First, flatness represents the drawing board and picture plane, and second, it describes the material realities of construction. I'm interested in challenging convention within both those practices. I interrogate techniques of projective representation that are instrumental in discovering and inventing new geometric vocabularies and spatial relationships. On the one hand, for example, how tools of vision and perspective can inform urban and architectural form, and on the other, engaging methodologies that equate design with constructability through material flatness. A lot of my work draws from historical techniques that considered this economical relationship between design, material, and the labor of construction, many of which were highly computational but deployed the simplest and most rudimentary tools of production: linear carving tools, a compass, and a ruler. Learning from these early technologies helps us better understand both the virtues and concerns of the digital processes of contemporary practice, which I believe have complicated our relationship with architectural form and building practices. I often look to other disciplines, like cartography, for instance, to understand how projective transformations can help us think more critically about visual perception and other forms of bodily experience. I look at techniques that map the globe onto a plane to draw relationships between central and parallel projections in ways that allow us to rethink traditional modes of inhabiting space, challenging building functions, types, and programs. I use these techniques to study the misalignments between cognitive perception of an image in the mind and the reality produced by the hand, challenging the limitations of the static image in representing movement, as well as exploring the vast potential of the drawn line to invite a plurality of interpretations. An image suggests infinite possibilities of three-dimensional realities, depending on who is interpreting it and how and why. My most recent design research and built work considers this organic link between material flatness and drawing as an opportunity to fuse the design process with construction, which allows us to both think in 2D and 3D simultaneously, something first years are dealing with right now and know all too well, and start thinking about material economy and labor early in the design process and not as a separate problem of construction. Over the past several decades, the ability to so easily produce formal complexity has disregarded the realities of material waste, cost of building, tectonic considerations, and access to design. By engaging the isometric relationship between flatness and three-dimensional form, I've been looking at how waste-conscious approaches to geometric exploration can create new architectural languages. This particular line of inquiry attempts to address three primary issues. First, to fuse the design process with constructability. Second, to design the part and whole simultaneously. And third, to create a workflow whereby complex three-dimensional forms are designed, fabricated, stored, and transported in their compact two-dimensional state. Various efforts in the past have leveraged standard dimensions of readily available stock material, particularly 4 by 8 foot sheets, in this case plywood, to define tectonic and aesthetic characteristics of buildings. I like thinking about how tectonic expressions, in other words, the logic of assembly of parts, leaves traces of the labor of construction, sequences of assembly, and origins of materials themselves. Like the work of Eleanor Raymond, I'm interested in developing ways to deploy the rectangular sheet not to rationalize complex geometry, which is the more common practice today, but rather to generate it. This research is part of a larger inquiry into formal techniques which interrogate why and how certain materials, building types, and construction methods are often confined within exclusive social and political domains. The work tries to advance the discourse around computational architectural geometry by exploring how it can serve as interlocutor between the often disparate issues of environmental resilience, materiality, structure, and formal exploration. A few years ago, I collaborated with the City of Cambridge's Community Development Department to identify urban heat islands as part of the city's 10-year Resilient Cambridge program. In addition to planting more trees and investing in green space, they were interested in installing temporary shade structures in lower-income neighborhoods as a form of public art to invite curiosity and activity. Because of the nature of the project, it was important that these structures are cheap, quick, and easy to design and install. Placing material waste and cost as a primary constraint became the central focus of the project. The project sourced local, off-the-shelf rectangular sheets of HDPE, a recyclable, UV-resistant material that's affordable and easy to use as a building block for a shade and seating structure. The technique shown here, a subset of curved crease folding, which is similar to origami, maps rectangular sheets onto cylindrical and conical structural surfaces. The entirety of each sheet is used. No part is cut and thrown out. Instead, they're merely scored and bent into shape on site, requiring few and simple fabrication processes. So this allows us to both design and construct in 2D entirely, stitching sheets together in the flat state and inflating them into their three-dimensional structural forms on site. Shout out to my amazing research team at the time, Audrey, Jack, Rashad, and Pietro, and later Becca Shalip, for their contributions to this. And although they're outstanding designers, thinkers, and makers, neither they nor I are experienced fabricators. And I mention this because a big part of this work attempts to embed the complexity of the process of construction into the geometric DNA of the material, making the structures possible to install with minimal skill and cost. It's fruitful and uplifting for both my students and myself to witness firsthand the immediate impact that research that may seemingly be couched within the academy as a highly disciplinary endeavor, which it is, as something that can also be explained to members of the public, particularly those whom this work affects and serves. Daycare children and students from the nearby elementary school would come out and curiously ask about the project during their recess hours. Public housing residents from across the street would so generously bring us cold water while we were working in the heat, and share stories about how the space has evolved over the years. And this one guy who teaches tennis lessons at the court adjacent to the park, and whose mother the park happens to be named after, would come by and talk about how important it is to be involved in shaping the public spaces of our communities. It also became a new location for GSD student yoga sessions. Because of the temporary nature of this type of work, the lifespan of the material was considered so that once the structure is dismantled, the sheets can be reconfigured as loose park furniture. We demonstrated this at an Earth Day event organized by a local volunteer group to have school children in the area learn about climate change and sustainability, making their own little shade structures out of household materials. I'm now developing these techniques to explore other types of spatial scenarios, fine-tuning assembly mechanisms to further streamline the process of installation, and incorporating structure into the surface geometry itself. Over the past 2 years at Syracuse, I've been working with the landscape architect to learn about how we can be more deliberate with community-engaged processes, focusing on the co-production of knowledge between researchers, students, and community members. And I'll end by mentioning that in the spirit of relevance, not everything we do may seem to be immediately relevant or impactful. I think about this often with my work, which spans theory and practice. A mentor once told me that if something seems to be at least remotely exciting to me, it is worth pursuing, even if you can't answer the so what question immediately. You don't know when or where or how it can become relevant and applicable, but relevance has various audiences, and sometimes it's okay, great even, to pursue things just for the intellectual engagement and satisfaction it brings you. Eventually, it will contribute to your outlook in both implicit and explicit ways. But we also have more agency to affect change than we might think. We can and should work with policymakers, clients, community organizers, and not wait for them. The shade structure project that I just showed came about during the pandemic when I would go out for long walks, as many of us did, and noticed that many of our parks were underutilized or even fenced off. I wrote to the city of Cambridge myself and asked if there were opportunities to do something that would encourage outdoor gathering during COVID in the summer heat and activate our open spaces. And this process taught me that though many don't look directly to architects to address society's challenges, our responsibility is not only to design, but to educate about the power of design as something that perhaps won't totally change the world, but at least make it a little bit better, more beautiful, and more meaningful. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come to this incredible place. I can't wait to get to know all of you. I am brand new, so I'm just very excited. And I'm also just grateful for this opportunity to introduce myself today. Because I'm new, it's really great to have a chance to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. But to put it simply, much of my work revolves around trying to understand the relationship between, on one hand, urban and architectural form, and on the other, our current energy paradigm, which is based on fossil fuels. And when I have to describe my work in just one sentence, I often say that I study how the adoption of fossil fuels changed the spatial organization of human society. And that's, of course, just a one-sentence descriptor, so I'm skipping some of the nuance, but I think it serves as a starting point simply to say that there are spatial configurations that are specific to a fossil fuel society. And you might immediately think of suburbs or shopping malls and parking lots or transit hubs and infrastructural connectors. Those are, of course, easy ones because they have something to do with the emergence of cars. But there's also a typological evolution at the scale of the building that's important, because harnessing the power of fossil fuels is not just about movement, it's also about labor and the reorganization of productive forces. So factories, worker housing, warehouses, distribution centers, office towers, apartment buildings, skyscrapers, these are all part of the story. And they're the spatial building blocks of the modern world. And I like to call them carbon form, right? And I define that as the spatial and formal configurations that are unique to the carbon era. Now, of course, they're energy intensive and they're often dependent on hydrocarbons to function. But for me, it's perhaps equally important, or maybe even more important, that they hold an energy intensive society in place, dictating movement and juxtapositions in the built environment. And it's a unique spatial order, which I would argue is one of the underlying causes of the climate crisis. But before I continue, I do want to clarify one thing, because I say that, but it would be easy for my thesis to be interpreted as a claim that form follows energy. In other words, that architecture and urban form are predetermined by our energy paradigm, right? That we adopt fossil fuels and suddenly, boom, we get skyscrapers, right? This is too simple of a narrative. And although, of course, increased access to energy often correlates to greater architectural ambitions, nonetheless, I don't believe that the architecture of the carbon era is simply an epiphenomenon or simply just resultant. There's nothing inevitable, at least in its specifics, about carbon form. And one of the reasons that I think it's worth studying is that the history of carbon form is a story about design. It's a story about architecture. And by architecture, I don't just mean buildings, I also mean architectural thought. And in many ways, what I'm trying to do is to study the evolution of architectural thought relative to humanity's dominant energy paradigms. This is not the most common, or maybe not the most obvious link between architecture and energy, but nonetheless, I believe it has to be made in order to fully understand architecture's relationship to the climate crisis. So just to give you a quick example, it's not a stretch to say that the forms proposed by modernist design were directly linked to the availability of dense and abundant energy. There's a very clear link, whether we're talking about European modernism or the Soviet revolutionary architecture or late modern megastructures or even corporate modernism. Architects in the 20th century were giving form to an industrial society. They were lending the power of architecture and of form and of organization to the establishment of a new world order that was based on industry. So as we think about how we arrived to where we are today, the spatial reordering of human society that happened as industry developed is a hugely important part of that story. So based on that, it's my contention that when it comes to climate change, understanding the evolution of architectural thought is just as important as understanding how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere or how much carbon moves through any one particular building. Because it's not only the construction of architecture and the operation of buildings that contributes to the climate crisis, it's also the arrangement of space itself. And that's both at the urban and architectural scale. So that's where I arrive at the theme of the evening, relevance, because I would argue that at the core of the climate crisis, there is a spatial problem. And we are a discipline that not only produces and manipulates space, but also that studies its history and theorizes its implications. And so I think that architecture is one of the most relevant disciplines to the current crisis. And I don't say that out of rosy optimism or a kind of self-interested belief in our own importance. It's actually more that if we don't recognize the role that architecture has played in all of this, we're going to continue to reproduce a spatial order that has already pushed us to a precipice. And the thing is that no one else is going to solve that problem for us, because in many ways it requires architectural thinking to recognize the problem in the first place. But also it goes in the other direction too, because we're not just a discipline that studies space, we're also a discipline that makes space and that manipulates space. So that means that we're also in a position to propose an alternative. So that's the overall framework that I'm working within. And so now I just want to briefly show you 3 different avenues by which I explore the topic. The first is writing. This is an issue of Log that I guest edited and wrote the introductory essay to, and it's the first time I published the theory of carbon form, but I've continued to write about it today, or since then, I should say. And writing has been hugely important to me. But I've also been producing visual works. And this is important to me because I'm arguing that there is a legible spatial paradigm. And part of the work I'm trying to do is to define it. And I think you can't only do that by just giving a slew of examples. I think it's also a question of analyzing those examples and looking at the patterns and the tendencies that help us to understand the spatial and the formal qualities of carbon form. So to that end, a few years ago, I began a collaboration with 2 friends to make a body of visual works that would offer a kind of working vocabulary of carbon form. The work was shown in an exhibition at the Cooper Union in 2023, and then it was at Roger Williams University. It's actually opening at Cornell this fall. It was titled Confronting Carbon Form, with the spirit that we have to learn to define the spatial paradigm and confront it as a first step to addressing, or not a first step, there have been many steps, but one of many important steps to addressing the climate crisis. So the exhibition consisted of a collection of original works in several media, from drawing to painting to model, and also mixed media pieces and projection. And together they work to give a multifaceted definition of carbon form. And I'm showing several installation views here, but of course I don't have time to speak about all of these today, but I am going to speak about one just to give you a sense of how I've been working. So this is a piece that's dedicated to identifying 5 urban archetypes that are characteristic of carbon form. And these 5 are not meant to be exhaustive, but in my work I have found these to be patterns that are repeated over and over again, and I find them to be important building blocks for contemporary built form, and they do have in some way a direct correlation to dense and abundant energy. So the point of departure for this piece was the selection of a specific project, or a precedent, I should say, that was critical to the origin of each archetype. And they're listed here, including the drawing that we worked from. But so there are 2 important elements to the piece as it was installed. First is a mirrored box, inside of which we modeled one of the drawings I just mentioned. And the mirrors are used to reveal a disposition towards replication, which I would say is one of the characteristics of carbon form at the urban scale. But also each model was accompanied by a series of satellite images that are displayed in the accordion of images that you see below the model. And these are showing instances of that archetype in the physical world. So this pairing with a hypothetical project archetype that was imagined by a specific author and the proliferation of its instances not only emphasizes carbon form's capacity for replication, but in my mind it also shows the importance of architectural ideas. Right? Each of these authors of the designs that we modeled generated in a particular moment in time a new idea for a spatial organization. And whether that specific design was built or not doesn't necessarily affect its impact, because in the end, each became an archetype and a model and was replicated all over the world in some way. There's also a sense of excess and absurdity that I was interested in making these models, because one of the things that we see across all of them, whether it's a cityscape or whether it's a suburb, whether dense or sparse, you see a disposition towards multiplication and growth. So as you can see, the models and the images are critical instruments for making carbon form legible. And that, in my view, speaks to the way in which architecture as a discipline has unique tools at its disposal that can help us understand the problem at hand. And in terms of my own work, I see this as a kind of hybrid way of working. There's an active reciprocity between theory and design. And lastly, I'll just conclude by talking a little bit about my teaching, which is the 3rd avenue that I used to explore. And this is just student work that's just kind of flipping through here. But for me, the classroom has been a wonderful place of experimentation over the past 6 years, and I hope to continue that here. And essentially, in my courses, I ask my students to study the built environment around them or study architectural history, select a precedent that they think is carbon form, and then they have to argue why they believe it is carbon form. So the tools by which they do it are important, how they draw it is important, but also how they study space and form is very important to me through it. And I think for me reflects the fact that I see architecture as a mode of knowledge, a way of reading the world. If it's a project-based seminar, I also ask students to consider what a counter-project might be. How do you counter the logic of carbon form in some way? And I'm hoping to continue that work here with you. And also, I just want to end by saying, don't hesitate to introduce yourself to me, because I don't know anybody. So don't be shy.
Thanks so much for the incredibly warm welcome. Let's start here with a quick image. We see GSD alum and one of my co-directors at Pompeii, Catherine Gleason, teaching students this summer how to excavate an ancient flower pot that we cut out of the garden, transported to the lab in preparation for publication. In my work, relevance is a function of invisibility and the ancient climate, and we'll see this today in 3 vignettes. In my research at the archaeological excavation I co-direct of one of the largest urban gardens at Pompeii, and in the classroom. Visualizations and representations of modern design spaces typically omit a critical component: the laborers, often undocumented migrant workers, who create and maintain these spaces. This problem isn't unique to the contemporary period, and in fact is found in many historic periods as well. And it's this invisibility that is central to my work on the ancient environment. And that's because scholars have largely only focused on the design history and material culture of the elites, not the people who made the spaces. Although there's been some work on ancient practitioners like architects, sculptors, and painters, there's one group that's been largely overlooked, namely enslaved, freed, and free-born landscape architects, gardeners, and garden laborers. And they are the focus of my work. I find evidence of these invisible Romans, as we call them, in, for example, funerary inscriptions, like this one belonging to Fortunatus, an enslaved landscape architect. It was commissioned by his enslaved wife and his enslaved apprentice. In representations like this fresco painting, which omit laboring bodies, right? But they capture the hand of the gardener in precisely depicted prune marks as we see here on this dwarfed plane tree. In artifacts like this bronze collar that would have been worn around the neck of an enslaved landscape architect and warned passers-by not to detain him. In gardening tools and many different types of eco-artifacts, including casts of 2,000-year-old ancient trees, like this example here that's bent under the force of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, or this dragon skin cast from the peristyle garden at the Villa Ariana in the Bay of Naples. We see the stake and the root, and let's be honest, they also make pretty fantastic mustaches. Unlike other historians who utilize anthropogenic time, so it's time that's based on political systems, for example, the empire or the republic, I look at the evidence through ecological or environmental time, specifically through the lens of the Roman climate optimum, a period that spanned roughly 200 BCE to 150 CE. The natural archive, so that's tree rings, ice core samples, ocean data, they all illustrate that this period was marked by unusually stable, moist, and warm climatological conditions that were distinctly different from the preceding and following centuries. And it's these ideal climatological conditions that fueled the development of the Roman Empire and relatedly drove the enslavement of horticultural laborers, gardeners, and yes, even of designers. These same themes drive my team's work at the Casa della Regina Carolina excavation at Pompeii, a project that's been made possible by the support of the GSD, National Geographic, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the European Research Council, Dumbarton Oaks, among many others. Before the eruption of 79, and we see the plume, there we go. We see the plume of the eruption here. There was a devastating earthquake in 62, so just a few years before, that radically altered the ancient urban environment of the city. Between the years of 62, so the earthquake, and the eruption of 79, Pompeii became a city of gardens, as we see in this lower map here. The rubble from the earthquake was used to create level open areas that were then covered with soil and were planted. Our garden, right here, is a result of this resilient post-earthquake design. The site was originally excavated in the early 1800s by the Borbone royal family, who were really only interested in the wall paintings and the statuary. The garden was left unexcavated. Since 2018, my team and I have discovered fragments of the 79 CE garden, including the compacted, I keep mixing up the buttons, there we go, including the walkway here, and multiple aligned planting pits and flower pots that we see in the green on the central plan. Our research has been focused mainly on two major areas. One, on studying the evidence of invisible Romans, i.e. non-elite use of the space, and 2, on developing new methods of studying the ancient environment. We'll take a look at 2 of these new methods today. The 1993 blockbuster movie Jurassic Park, not where you thought this was probably going, centered around the premise that dinosaur DNA was trapped in and preserved in a mosquito in prehistoric amber. Well, using actually a fairly similar concept, we've discovered that ancient wall painting acts as amber for ancient pollen. And this is because in antiquity, as today, fresco painting is largely done in the springtime when conditions are ideal so that the paintings dry evenly and smoothly. As a result, wet paint captures springtime pollination. I get very excited about this. So as a result, we've discovered a method for capturing an ecological snapshot, not only of the insect pollinated plants that are directly in our garden, but also a snapshot of the wind pollinated ones from the surrounding region. We've also discovered 2,000-year-old ethereal, ghostly footsteps in the soil. Micromorphology, that is, the microscopic analysis of soils, has long been used in archaeology for ancient floors, i.e. interior domestic spaces. But we're the first team to test this method on ancient garden soil surfaces. We've taken small cubes of soil, about yay size, small, and excavated them under a microscope, slice by slice, as we see in this example here. Based on the compaction and composition of the soil, we've been able to ascertain which parts of the garden in antiquity featured high, medium, and low pedestrian traffic. This will not only impact our interpretations of how the space was used, but will of course impact how we populate our reconstructions, such as this one from the previous summer before we had this data. These ethereal footsteps, evidenced in microscopic soil compaction, also underscore the incredible temporality and impact of anthropogenic activity on the environment. Mere steps leave signs for thousands of years. In the seminar I'm teaching this fall, Translation and Negotiation, the Roman Landscape in the Modern World, we explore the continued relevance of the classical past in the design and visual history of the US. Each week, we examine a different palimpsestic history, uncovering hidden layers. In one class, during a visit to the Harvard Map Collection, we consider the relationship between replication, translation, appropriation, and even the potential of reappropriation. With the aid of the map collection, we'll explore how Roman centuriation and Roman surveying methods influenced early American cartography, how that impacted the military track of upstate New York with its incredible amount of classical place names. I did just come from Cornell, i.e. from Ithaca, so I'm the Odysseus in the group. And the potential for reappropriation or resistance, as seen in this Haudenosaunee collage here that overlays an Onondaga wampum belt and strawberry popcorn over colonialist boundaries. Depictions such as this collage append traditional notions of power and cartographic agency and serve as a critical learning tool. The work I've exhibited today, my own research with my team at Pompeii and in the classroom, is the result of profoundly interdisciplinary work and collaborations drawing on nearly all colleges within the university. I've relied on the strengths of performance and visual artists, entomologists, architects and landscape architects, soil scientists, volcanologists, faunal experts, ceramic artists, and even video game designers, to name just a few. I look forward to cross-pollinating conversations with GSD scholars, practitioners, and students that will undoubtedly enrich these projects immeasurably. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Lee Bar-Sinai, and I'm an assistant professor of materials and design and landscape architecture, but actually I'm returning. I was a Loeb Fellow here in 2013, so I'm excited to see those of you I know and to get to know those I don't know yet, and really happy to be here. So thank you for the kind introduction, Dean Whiting, and it was wonderful to see all these presentations. So my research explores the relationship between materials, tools, and the environment. One way I do this is by experimenting with robotic forming of natural materials like sand and soil, as you can see in this video. To address the theme of today, I want to highlight the relevance of matter, tools, and the environment. And we'll start with the relationship between environment and materials. I want to start by sharing a story that led me to shift from practice to academia, to getting a PhD, a postdoc, and now teaching, and now coming here. So what you see here is a public square that I constructed with my colleague in southern Israel, Kibbutz Be'eri. And the reason I'm showing you the left picture is because I want to talk about the right side of the picture. So during construction, I began to critically question the process, a typical process we conduct when constructing such a space. So we demolished whatever is there, and then we remove the debris. Nobody dare ask where that goes to. We displaced large amounts of soil, and then we bring in important materials, including foundational layers of earth. And we're doing this in an era that we can essentially 3D print almost anything, anywhere. Now let's take a look at these bricks for a second. Before becoming part of a pavement, these bricks were on the right, loose piles of aggregates. Before getting there, they were mined and transported to the site. And so today, sand and aggregates have become the most mined solid materials worldwide. In fact, our consumption has tripled in the last 2 decades. So it's crucial, therefore, that we rethink our approach to materials, not only because of their environmental impact, but also because of their growing scarcity. And the depletion of primary materials like sand is leading to conflicts, it's leading to sand wars, it's leading even to the emergence of sand mafias. I believe it's our responsibility to develop alternatives that are not just conceptual, but are really rooted in solid scientific knowledge. And these are some of the things I will be doing here at the GSD. So looking at materials and tools, I'd like to share a little bit of the material research that I've been exploring with my students and my colleagues, and some that I will pursue. One approach we tested is reconstituting found matter that is still abundant, like desert sand, which still covers a large portion of the earth. Though it does not currently meet the standards of construction, research on how it might be utilized is emerging. We investigated this approach with our student in a desert site in Israel. We collected and analyzed various sand samples, working with an alternative binders lab at the Technion in Israel. We then prepared materials for fabrication, and we tested various assemblies that could be formed through 3D printing the material. This process, which is we call it reconstitution, essentially repurposes found matter into a construction material. In a similar way, we developed a method that we call carve to print. where we harvest material from a solid surface, and then we return it to the surface by 3D printing it. This can be thought of maybe as the cut and fill version of solid materials like stone. And it could be used, for example, to form paths on rough terrains in a way that is unique to each terrain. As I will be academically involved with the material collection here, one plan is to work with the team here to expand it into a platform for advancing material alternatives for construction. This image, I chose this one by the Japanese photographer Shibata Toshio because it hints at the potential of using geotextiles for shaping landscapes, one avenue of exploration that I want to pursue alongside fabrication with biomaterials, multi-material fabrication, and of course, we welcome your involvement. The third relationship I would like to discuss is between tools and the environment. During my time at the Technical University of Munich, we developed the notion of precision landscapes. Similar to precision medicine, which tailors treatment to individual patients, precision landscapes we see as a practice that applies precision to site-specific landscape forming. Precision can be applied towards a higher degree of accuracy in forming, by, for example, through repeated iteration, or it can be applied for environmental and performative purposes. So one example of that is we developed a process that allowed us to test the forming of subsoil while separating and preserving the topsoil. The topsoil, for those who don't know, is where most of the biological soil activity takes place, and the loss of this precious soil is damaged during earthworks, leading to a significant land degradation worldwide. So to combat this, we wanted to develop a color-based method that would allow us to discern how the layers are distributed after we form them. You can see in the center, in the middle of the image, that this is not something we can see with normal soil or sand. Another example, the students conducted a thermodynamic analysis of Arctic winds and then designed a dynamic snow forming concept to mitigate them. And they developed a concept you can see on the left of a kind of a hijacked snowplow that would be used to construct these formations. A third example of precision landscapes addresses what the World Health Organization declared as the #2 environmental health risk in Europe. It is noise. Noise pollution. So we sought for method to mitigate noise through landscape designs in an area adjacent to the Munich airport. That was a case study. And what we did is we developed a method for sampling noise on site and then designed alternative undulating forms and tested them in various heights in a digital twin, which is a model representing the site and the noise captured on it before and after our interventions. That allowed us to compare different designs in terms of their noise mitigation effectiveness. We worked on a local scale, but the simulation of environmental phenomena could soon be conducted on a planetary scale. For example, using an upcoming tool developed by NVIDIA last year, Earth-2. Earth-2 is essentially the most powerful AI supercomputer, a digital twin of the Earth. It can allow us to simulate strategies for dealing with climate change and accelerate the development of effective mitigation strategies at territorial scales. To support landscape forming at multiple scales, we developed the use of robotic agents for forming loose aggregates into desired formations. Though this work we began at the Technion is still in very early stages, the potential of this technology is vast. Because while tools may be small, the natural world is full of examples in which the actions of small individuals give rise to complex behaviors and structures which greatly exceed the size of a single agent. For example, in termite mounds, as shown here. In other cases, like beaver dams, The collective construction process offers another benefit, a response to environmental feedback. We're looking to learn from them. In a collaboration that's already started with Harvard Seas, we're trying, and we're welcoming anyone interested, to imagine how it would look like to program a robotic swarm that can adjust and adapt grounds to environmental challenges. This could open the door to a new field of research, going beyond construction robotics and toward environmental robotics. To conclude, by linking materials, tools, and the environment, we can transform how we design from small to planetary scales. We can build from found matter, we can compose and combine materials, and eventually we can grow on and even grow our walls. And we can do so with a growing precision, which will allow us at one point to operate like surgeons on the landscape. Thank you.
Wow. So my mind is reeling, and I want to thank our 8 presenters whom I'm so excited to have in the school. So another round of applause for all 8 of them. But I also want to thank the faculty search committees who brought you here, because I think what's very interesting to me is seeing certain themes that cross across all of these presentations and the work that's being done by these 8 people that will come into the school in an extraordinary way. And so I think that we are all abuzz. We can carry that buzz to the porticos, where we have an all-school reception waiting for you. So you 8 will be swarmed, but I promise you will get food and drink. But I encourage everyone to continue the conversation over in the porticos. So thank you very much.